everyone. Welcome to the panel from the faculty in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. We're going to introduce ourselves briefly, and then we're going to have some general discussion about COVID. So let's see, Ms. Bates, can you take it away?
Sure. My name is Tanya Bates, and I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Biological Sciences, and I teach introductory biology, so I hope to see you in my courses.
Dr. Armstrong.
Dr. Armstrong.
Yes, so I'm Dr. Armstrong. I am faculty in the Department of Psychological Science and in the Health Psychology PhD program. I'm also a licensed psychologist focusing on children and families, and I teach infant and child development, children's mental health, and treatment interventions for children and families.
And I'm Lisa Rasmussen. I'm a professor in the Department of Philosophy, and I'm a faculty fellow in the graduate school, and my focus is medical ethics. So we're going to move on to our first question here. How do we know what we know?
Okay, guys, so I'm Ms. Bates, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how biology works. So how do we know what we know in biology? So first, just biology is the study of life and living things, and it falls under this umbrella of science. And what I want you to understand is that science is a process. It's this process where biologists gather information, and we call this information data or data. So after we collect this data, we make interpretations about it. We try to figure out things from this information. And there's lots of different types of research that we can use to collect this data. There's 3 different types. The first is basic research. So basic research is the research that provides this foundation. So a foundation of knowledge that we use to build upon. That's the first level. Think of it as if you're a chef. And as a chef, you need to know all the ingredients that are going to go into your dish. That's that basic research. Then we have translational research. This is where we apply that information that we've learned from basic research. So we take the information and we integrate it into a recipe. For COVID-19, basic research is figuring out things like the structure of the virus. Then translational research is figuring out pharmaceuticals or vaccines that we can use or tests that we can use for this particular virus. The third type of research that biologists do is what we call clinical research. And this is research where we are testing on lots of individuals. So right now we're doing some of these types of clinical tests where we're looking at vaccines. And this is a tightly regulated, controlled process. And I'll talk more about it. Quickly, just all these types of research you can think of sort of as a loop. They all connect together. They're not independent from each other. That's one really important thing. The other thing I want you to think about is where you get this information. Scientists publish this research in scientific journals. And when you see the information, you need to go back to that original source, not just the news media or the blog that you're looking at, but go back to the original source. Source is really important for science. I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Armstrong.
Thank you. So in terms of a psychological perspective, how do we know what we know? So there are different ways to gather data based on your research questions. In psychology, our goal is to discover new and better ways for people to exist and even thrive in a complex world. So we're interested in how people think, how they feel, and how they behave at both biological and behavioral levels. So our questions really tend to focus on the relationships between the brain and behavior, and between the environment and behavior. And in psychology as well, we have different types of research. We have the basic, translational, and clinical, as Ms. Bates talked about. And our typical ways of gathering data, though, for psychology include 4 different methods. So one method would be observations, or watching what people do in different environments. A second method would be neurological or physiological, and this is where we would measure brain activation, heart rate, stress hormones, things like that in response to specific events. We also have standardized tests as a third method. So think of IQ testing, memory testing, college entrance exams like the SATs. And finally, we have self-report. And this is where we ask people directly through interviews and questionnaires about their circumstances and experiences. For the purpose of understanding COVID-related issues, almost all of the data that's been collected has been gathered through self-report. So we really want to understand what people are thinking, how they're feeling, and how they're behaving throughout this pandemic. We're trying to understand more about their experiences and their perceptions of the world and their experiences, with the appreciation that perceptions are important, even if they don't always align with reality. In psychology, we also try and understand these factors at different levels. So we want to understand both at the individual level, so each person, how each person is thinking, behaving, and feeling, but we also want to understand this at a collective level as well. So when we think about how families are coping, how communities, like the Charlotte community, different neighborhoods within Charlotte, how they might be coping in different ways with the pandemic, as well as institutions, how are healthcare institutions and educational institutions coping, and how are different societies dealing with this pandemic? So how might the US be managing in ways that are similar or different to how, for example, China or Germany is dealing with the pandemic? So our understanding of behavior is really critical in our efforts to cope and contain the spread of COVID. Most of this work currently is translational. We want to really understand risk or vulnerability for COVID and COVID-related problems, and we want to understand protective factors. So what are some ways that there are opportunities for positive adaptation, growth, and even resilience in the face of this COVID adversity? So now I'll turn it over to Dr. Rasmussen, who will provide a perspective on knowledge based on the philosophy of science.
Hey everyone, I love this question because one of the things that philosophy asks on a regular basis is, how do we know something? And so with respect to the pandemic, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we think we know. We think we know based on what we read, but what we actually tend to act on in terms of knowledge is things we've heard other people talking about, or the media that we selectively consume. And so we are going to be subject to other people's ideas about what we ought to know or what's true of the world, unless we go out and actively try to find that information for ourselves. And this is the kind of thing that Socrates, the famous Greek philosopher, had in mind when he said, the unexamined life is not worth living. We need to ask questions about life in order to know that. So when we think about COVID, we want to start thinking about, what are the conditions of knowledge? Under what conditions do we think we know something? And that is a field that the philosophy of science focuses on, and that suggests there are good and bad ways and lots of in-between ways of understanding what it is to know something. So if you are interested in these kinds of questions and you kind of want to get behind the curtains of claims about knowledge, then that's the kind of thing you might find in a philosophy class. So our next question is, what do we know? And I'm going to hand it to Dr. Armstrong.
In terms of what we know from a psychological perspective, there are lots of questions we might ask. The one that I am going to focus on for the nature of this panel is, what do we know about the effects of COVID on physical and mental health among young people, so among adolescents and young adults? So what we know is that there's been an increased prevalence of mental health problems among young people. One study found that actually about 44% of youth were reporting depressive symptoms, 37% were reporting anxiety symptoms, and many reported both depression and anxiety symptoms at levels that were far higher now than they were pre-COVID. What we're also learning is that females, older students, so students that are closer to graduation, and those from more disadvantaged backgrounds are reporting greater mental health challenges in the context of COVID. We also have been learning that as related to COVID, that there's been an exacerbation of pre-existing mental health problems. So folks who struggled with anxiety or depression before COVID are having increased or experiencing increased anxiousness due to fear of the virus. And for folks who had struggled with ADHD, for example, we're noticing worse behavior problems, more trouble with concentration because of all of the disruption of habits and familiar structures. We've also learned that there are increases in loneliness, alcohol use, stress and anger, as well as increases in technology. So this is interesting because technology has been found to be somewhat of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it helps us to be connected to others, especially in this landscape of physical distancing. But on the other hand, social media use in particular has been associated with worse mental health, and seeking too much information about COVID has been related to more intense worry. So technology is one that's a little bit more unclear in terms of its usefulness. And finally, we find that a lot of young people are having disrupted sleep. So going to bed later, waking up earlier, spending more time in bed, but having a worse quality of sleep. So really we find that there have been a lot of negative effects for mental health, and also some disruptions to physical health habits as well. So now I will turn it over to Ms. Bates so she can tell us more about what we know from a biological perspective.
So let's frame what we know again in the context of what we talked about, the types of research we do in biology. So for basic research, what do we know? We know about the structure of the virus. We know about classification of this virus. And originally we called this the novel coronavirus because it was a new virus that we were studying. Coronaviruses we've studied for a long time, but this is a new one. We transitioned that name then to coronavirus disease, or COVID-19, 19 for 2019. And now we call it SARS-CoV-2 because we know even more about it. It's related to this sudden acute respiratory syndrome, which is what SARS stands for. So we know how the virus is transmitted. It's transmitted from person to person through respiratory droplets, talking, coughing, sneezing, singing. And we know that there are certain groups of people who are more susceptible and more at risk for this particular virus. In terms of translational research, we know less, but we do know what medications, what antivirals will work against SARS-CoV-2, and that's very few. There are none that we can use therapeutically or for treatment right now. We do know that we have 150 vaccines that are ranging from preclinical to clinical, so that the large human trials that we talked about, so preclinical being in a laboratory like at UNC Charlotte. And then the clinical research, there are a few a few vaccines that are in the early stages, like I said, of those phase 3 clinical trials. So there's a possibility to have a vaccine by the end of the year, potentially. We also know that face coverings work to prevent you transmitting the virus to someone else. Social distancing works to prevent transmission of the virus. Frequent hand washing is essential, and proper isolation, quarantine, and contact tracing of those who have this virus. And I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Rasmussen to talk about the philosophy perspective.
So one of the other things that I study is ethics. And I think one of the things we know in this pandemic is that it has disproportionately affected people who are already disadvantaged in our society. And that means we have to think about the existing structures in our society when we think about how the pandemic affects everyone. So you may have heard that there are testing rates and fatality rates that are different among different communities, for example, Caucasian or Latino or African American. And some people initially posit the idea that maybe there's a physical difference between people that accounts for that. But we also know that that's not the case. Science has made it abundantly clear it has nothing to do with our genetics that cause these differences. It's about the structures in our society. So for example, some people have access to healthcare, and that makes their underlying situation, health situation, better or worse than someone else's. So the problem that we're finding in the pandemic is that people who are already disadvantaged, having no access or little access to healthcare, are doubly disadvantaged when if they catch the virus. So that's a problem. Another ethical issue that came up early in the pandemic was the issue of resource allocation, and in particular, ventilators. And there were proposals not to give ventilators to people who were worse off. But if you recall what I was just saying, that means that the people who are already worse off through no fault of their own will be made doubly worse off if we allocate according to people's underlying healthcare issues. So as we think about, I apologize, as we think about vaccines, we're going to have to think about allocation in the same way. All right, so our last question is, what is in dispute? And I'm going to hand it off to Ms. Bates first. Sorry, no, Dr. Armstrong.
All right, so what is in dispute? There's a lot that we still don't know. And one of the biggest questions we have from a psychological perspective is whether the health effects, both mental health and physical effects, will lessen over time. Or in other words, what are the long-term impacts over months and years from COVID and from the strategies that we have to use, including physical distancing, et cetera, mask use, to try and decrease exposure. Another large question, especially in the current season, is do the academic, social, emotional, and behavioral benefits of in-person instruction and socialization for young people, do they outweigh the risk of COVID exposure? And finally, how do we best support individuals and families whose support systems, belief systems, and way of life may have been eroded by the pandemic? We're still trying to figure out how to best support other people. So now I'll hand it over to Ms. Bates.
So it's really important to remember that science is this process. This process is evolving. We're being informed from that data that we're collecting. And I just want to hit on one quick point, is that one example that you saw is the mask wearing. Originally, we were told not to wear a mask, and now we're told to wear a mask. So that arose because we wanted to make sure that healthcare workers had appropriate protective gear. Now we know that masks are essential in preventing these community outbreaks. So wearing a mask is just one of those things that we can do to help prevent the transmission of this particular virus. So we still don't know everything about SARS-CoV-2. We're still learning that basic research. We're learning about other animals that are affected by this virus. And we're still learning about therapies, especially vaccines. And I'll turn it over finally to Dr. Rasmussen.
So the one thing I wanted to talk about that I think is still in dispute picks up on something that Dr. Armstrong was talking about, which is reopening. Everyone wants to reopen society, but no one wants anyone to get hurt. And so how do we balance those things out? As Dr. Armstrong was saying, we know for sure that there are people who are suffering, in particular kids and adolescents, for whom socialization is really important at this age. But on the other side of the coin, there are people who are suffering not being able to go to work and provide for families, and that has mental health impacts, it has health impacts and things like that. So one of the things that strikes me when I hear people talk about it is how certain some people are that the answer is just so obvious that we either should open or we should not open. And I think one of the things we have to think about is, what are the conditions under which we'd feel fairly confident about opening or not opening? I don't have an answer to that question, unfortunately, but I am certain that there's no easy answer to that question. And so I would just encourage you to push back on people who think it's obvious and there's no objection to opening.
So we know that you'll have questions at the live session in September for us, but in the meantime, we have some questions for each other. So I'll start us off. Dr. Rasmussen, how might the resource allocation issues that were particularly salient for ventilators come into play with other aspects of dealing with COVID? So on the one hand, we have the issue with test kits. It seems like there are some populations, like athletes, who are getting tested every day or every other day, while other people who have higher risk for COVID, like teachers and others, are having trouble getting tested. And in terms of the vaccine, are there resource allocation issues that might come into play regarding who's likely to get the vaccine more quickly and who is likely to have to wait?
Yes, absolutely there are. And in fact, right before we split for online in the spring, in my healthcare ethics class, we were playing a game about vaccine allocation in a pandemic. This is before we knew much about China. So absolutely. And what the kinds of things we were reading about were philosophical arguments about what kinds of people should have priority. And some arguments emphasize what we would call now essential workers, but in the pre-pandemic, we were calling first-line responders or something. So you want to give vaccines to people who are going to help other people survive, right? So it also might include janitors. It might include truck drivers. It might include people who work at the power company and things like that. I don't have a quick answer for you, but it's something very deliberate, and it matters too what the nature of the pandemic is. So if it affects younger people, you might want to vaccinate the younger people first versus the older people, or vice versa. And then there are all these inequality questions about teachers versus athletes that make us wonder about what kind of principles of justice we want in our society. So absolutely. So I'll take this opportunity now, and I'm going to ask Ms. Bates a question, which is, we've been developing multiple vaccines. We're seeing just recently that Russia approved one. I know there's some uncertainty about each of these vaccines. What have we learned during this vaccine development for COVID-19 that you think will maybe help us in future situations?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are a lot of things to think about. One is just sort of how vaccine development normally works. We go through the phases that we talked about. So these are phases that are regulated by government agencies. There's phase 1, which is a small scale study where we just look at a few people, maybe 50 people, and we test for dosage. We look for other things as well, but we're looking for the dose. We have phase 2, where we increase the number of participants in the study, and now we start looking for things like side effects from the vaccine. And then we have phase 3, where we do a large scale, where we might see side effects that didn't show up in the first 2 phases. And we look at if the vaccine is actually stimulating or causing the immune system to respond. Are we getting a response from that vaccine? I think one thing we've learned is that we can all work together if we have to. We have people in academia, people in government agencies, people around the world who have put this global sort of rush on this particular vaccine development. Now, just speaking to the vaccine in Russia, it's still in phase 1 clinical trials. So I'm looking for a phase 3 clinical trial, right? I'm looking for a vaccine that's come out of that, it's FDA approved, to know that it's safe and effective. But we do know that vaccine development is the only way that we're going to control this pandemic. And that leads me to a question for Dr. Armstrong. So can you provide any recommendations for UNC Charlotte students in managing this stress that is from COVID that you spoke about?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. So I wanted to take a step back for just a minute and clarify that COVID is disruptive in a lot of ways, and it's disrupting at least 5 key psychological needs that we have. So it's disrupting our sense of safety, the belief that your needs will be met and that you're protected from harm and that those around you will be safe and healthy. It's disrupting our ability to be calm, so be able to be relaxed and staying composed and grounded. It's disrupting our need for self-efficacy and community efficacy. So the belief that you can successfully do what you need to do and handle tough times, and that the community that you belong to, whether it's your neighborhood, your school, your city, can also do what it needs to do to thrive and take care of its members. Clearly, it's disrupting connectedness, having relationships with others, and it's disrupting our sense of hope. This idea that we expect that things will work out and a feeling that everything's going to be all right. And so there are really concrete strategies that you can do to kind of regain your foothold in these areas. So for example, there are behavioral strategies. One of the biggest ones is keeping a healthy routine as much as possible. So really basic things like getting enough sleep, eating regularly and healthfully, drinking plenty of water, exercising regularly, very basic things that can become easily disrupted in the context of COVID. Spending time outdoors. So obviously we might need a physical distance, but being outdoors has been shown to improve your mood. Again, we can limit our consumption of media and news stories, even though you might want to know the facts, quote unquote. Oftentimes, watching too much media, social media, and news can make you feel worse, can make you feel more worried, more angry, more hopeless. So you can limit your consumption of that, and you'll find that you often will feel better. Doing activities that make you feel happy or give you relief. So music, downloading comedy, imagining people or places that have brought you joy. Those are some behavioral strategies that you can do anytime, really. There are also strategies that affect how you think and how you feel. And one of the biggest things is just to be aware that you're going to have strong feelings about the uncertainty. It's normal. We all have them and are having them. And so when you start to feel them, so starting to feel anxious or angry or sad, do something. Do something you enjoy. Do something that motivates you. Do something to help you to feel connected to others. Okay. Also, something else that you can do cognitively is adjust your expectations. Things are going to be harder. They may take longer than you planned, and that's okay. Adjust. Avoid dwelling on horror stories or rumors that you might hear, right? And instead connect with people. You know, you might have to do so remotely, but support seeking can be really important. So talking about your concerns, your thoughts, and your feelings with people you trust. It might have to be remote or over the phone. If you're still living at home, you might be able to have a trusted family member that you can talk to, but really not cutting yourself off from others. Another thing you can do on your own is practice mindfulness. So really easy strategies like slowing down your breathing as you inhale or exhale, doing guided visualizations or meditations can really help calm your body throughout the day and at night if you're having trouble sleeping. And finally, if you're really struggling with mental health issues, get help. All of the mental health providers, at least that I know of that I talk to, they're all doing teletherapy. So it doesn't require going into an office. You would basically call, make an appointment, and it would be virtual. So really, it's important to reach out and get more specific help from trained experts as you need to, as you struggle with mental health. The Counseling Center on campus, CAPS, is a very good resource. So with that in mind, I would say to just be kind to yourself and others in the days and weeks and months to come. Each of us responds differently. And so we really want to validate each other's experience, but also know that you're not alone. And there are lots of healthy ways to cope with the ongoing stress of the pandemic.
So that wraps up our questions that we had for each other. It wraps up sort of you learning about how science is done in different ways, how philosophy impacts science, and hopefully you've learned something from this. We really look forward to speaking with you again at the live question and answer session in September. Go Niners!
Mm-hmm.